The Symphony of Canterlot, Chapter 15, Sweet Illusion of Undeserving Bliss. Her Majesty Celestia looked at me for a second, her expression blank and focused. Then she took another sip from her black tea that time, though she added honey and a bit of what I can only guess is brandy that came from the ceramic bowl she summoned out of hammer space. I'm actually impressed that she knew such modern spellcraft.
So, you are saying that the evidence of these claims are in this shop, and that, if we can get that under a microscope, then it can be determined that the Philharmonic family is guilty of using dangerous magic against their only daughter?
I hunched at the table, looked her in the eye, and said, "Aye." She set her cup down and took in a deep breath. She then decided to get up, and the entire room became more silent as she did so. And then, I felt some pony grab a hold of me and give me a full bear hug. It was one of the telepaths, and she got behind me while I was distracted and decided that I needed one, apparently. It may be strange to see another pony doing that during this type of situation, but a telepath is, in a way, forced to empathize with those that they read due to the instinctual nature of their power. Most ponies would assume that telepathy is something that would come out of a unicorn spell, but in reality, it's an ability that can appear on any pony regardless of race. And earthen telepaths are actually some of the strongest due to their instinctual nature of earthen magic. It's a double-edged sword, though. Because it's instinctual, they can't really turn it off, at least not completely. They have to train to filter out any unnecessary foreign thoughts, or else they would go insane from the sensory overload of feeling, seeing, and smelling the memories of all the ponies around them. The rarity and difficulty of their training is what kept the concept of investigation to still exist, actually. Telepaths would have replaced every detective in existence otherwise. Though, I wouldn't wish any pony to hold on to my old job. Ask any of the telepaths that interrogated me that day. They got a taste of the sort of madness I had gone through. This is the work of ponies that are not sound of mind. I held to the left hoof while I took in a deep breath, and I then decided that it was best that I got up as well, considering that Princess Celestia was already out of the door and looking down at the city from the balcony. As the telepath was still reading my mind at that point, she let me go before I could say a word. She stepped back and I got up and headed after Celestia with as much calm as possible. I looked at Celestia as she sat on her haunches, contemplating what I could only assume at the time was the situation. Her prism-like mane of flowing ether and the alabaster color of her fur complemented each other surprisingly well with her gold regalia. Not to mention the fact that her figure was quite benefiting of a goddess, especially from the back. I audibly gulped before continuing to her side. I sat to her right and looked at her face, and tears were flowing down from her magenta eyes, sorrow written all over her face. One could only imagine what she thought back then, of her citizens, or her family, or, well, all the efforts she had put forth. In the end, she was the most powerful pony in the world, yet she could do nothing but watch as the ponies that she swore to protect spit in the face of everything she had ever worked for. That, to me, that was the final straw. They abused their own child, incinerated my apartment, slaughtered my friends, and they made the most beautiful mare in the world cry. With that in my mind, I came to a resounding conclusion. I needed my rifle. But then I mentally kicked myself in the back of the head. The princesses are suspects. Celestia could have properly arranged the transportation of the stars to Equestria, simply do nothing and wait for the Thule to try and release Nightmare Moon, and finally have an opportunity to release her sister. But then, I kept looking. And then I realized that while she is intelligent and powerful enough in every sense of the word, it would have been simpler to try and get the artifacts herself, use them, and then find a loophole around the sacrifice requirements. In the end, she is Celestia. If she was a detached monster interested in only her own benefit, she would have stayed in her birthland of Gaul with Luna and taken over the place with an iron hoof and an unhinged taste for vindicative slaughter. Especially considering the facts that their neighbors declared both Celestia and Luna witches, due to them both having a horn and wings, were sold into slavery before they could use their full power, and they were developing into the most beautiful mares in history. You can unfortunately guess what kind. We should count ourselves lucky that Star Swirl got to them before anything unsavory happened. And if you're asking how in Tartarus and the 9 Circles of Sheol I know this, you can blame AK Yearling for that.
Folklore, are you alright?
Celestia asked, noticing that I was no longer on Earth. Some tears were still visible on her face. So, I answered. Sorry, I just got lost in my thoughts. I think it's best if I prepare to leave. I don't think that it's wise for me to stay and take any more of your time. She then just hugged me, out of nowhere.
Just call me Celestia, you brilliant idiot.
I felt my cheeks redden at the sudden turn of events. I wasn't really sure if she should even do this out in the open or if I was even worthy of the affection, so I probably just said one of the stupidest things I've ever said in my life. Celestia, you can let me go now. She then let me go and then did her best to straighten herself out. I noticed that I was bare of my woolen long coat, so I looked to my left and I just found a dumbfounded bureaucrat with a rather nice handkerchief in his left suit pocket. Frankly, I don't know if my access to the ether had returned, but I decided to telekinetically take that handkerchief, and to my surprise, it actually flew out of that pocket and smacked me straight into the face. I then took it and gave it to Princess Celestia. I know, it's a tad silly, but leaving an upset mare without a handkerchief is something that I couldn't really sit right with. If I didn't provide one to a crying mare in front of me, I felt like my mother would somehow manifest herself from the grave and smack me in the back of the head for being an inconsiderate moron. Here, you should probably wipe the tears. You have a country to rule after all. She did as I said, and once she was done, she folded it neatly and trotted back to the table, with it floating by her side. I looked back to the poor stallion that I stole that from, a certain dotted Hieronymus line. He was staring at me with a blank expression, but I could tell something more than just contempt that was there, judging by the subtle glint in his eye. He was wearing a rather neat wine-red jacket with a silk cravat hiding what I can only guess is his service medallion. He looked at me, and with his golden aura, he telekinetically pulled a simple wooden pipe from his jacket, along with a small box of safety matches and some tobacco. As soon as he placed the tobacco in the pipe, I pyrokinetically lit it before he could use his matches, slightly startling him. I know it's not my place to say, but pyrokinesis is faster, and due to the ether's immaterial nature, it has no flavor. Unlike the matches you were about to use, I think it helps with the quality of the tobacco. He took a drag for a second, nodded with approval, and then talked to me. I won't say that I don't appreciate the courtesy, but I would have liked a warning first. I couldn't help but smirk slightly. This was rather entertaining. I should probably also thank you for lending me your handkerchief. He raised his eyebrow at me for that one, and then he exhaled a puff of smoke. This was gonna be fun. Careful, Lore. You know what was said about Icarus? I shot back in haste. Icarus never knew what he was dealing with anyway. I, on the other hoof, had an idea. I fancy myself as more of a Daedalus, maybe an Odysseus. Then, we heard the hoofsteps of a certain solar divine, causing us both to look behind us.
As much as I enjoy watching you two bonding, I believe you both have work to do.
We looked back at Princess Celestia incredulously. I felt like breaking the awkwardness since I had no need to make her feel uncomfortable. Right. I'll head out then. I began to trot in the direction of the door before being stopped by one of the telepaths. She then took off her cloak to reveal that she was white, blonde, and long-haired earthen. She stared through me with cold blue eyes.
Henry wants to see you.
That was the telepathic message she gave me. A mental image of it written down in plain old ink and paper. I couldn't help but smirk. Something was actually going my way on that venture. I winked her way and headed through the door with a newfound swagger. I was sure that I could finally do it. Get Arpeggio in hoofcuffs and have him tried publicly. His crimes exposed. His fellow Thule Esoteric Order brothers found, identified, and vulnerable. Make the whole thing a spectacle. As to let the aristocrats and the mad sorcerers know that they have no sway on the world anymore. To let them know that their dream of a unicorn-ruled world was about as ludicrous as a tyrannical Celestia. A more primal part of me demanded that I take Arpeggio's head and then have the rest of his body hanging in front of the Philharmonic Hall, but I wasn't gonna do that. That was a good high. I wish that I could have kept it going. I was greeted by one of Celestia's maids as she held a brown duffel bag in her mouth. It looked like one of mine, so I immediately took it off of her hooves, or, in this case, mouth. I shamelessly trotted past her without so much as a thought, only for her to quickly catch up with me. At the time, I simply thought that she wasn't gonna have none of my attitude.
Hey, stop! Do you even know where you're going? I'm supposed to escort you to your room.
I looked back, reacting to the sound of her voice. Truth be told, I was confused. I was planning on heading straight to the shop. I think you may be confusing me for somebody else, sweetheart, though I can't see how. Last time I checked, vagabonds aren't exactly allowed in here. I looked at her green eyes, sandy yellow color, and her seafoam mane with renewed interest, mainly in that she looked like she was slightly confused to what I said.
Aren't you Arcanum Folklore? Princess Luna's guests? She gave me orders to show you one of the diplomatic guest rooms.
Given that she said my name, and that she had a nervous look on her face, I concluded that she was new to working in Canterlot. But what she said gave me an alarm because no pony was supposed to know that I even knew Princess Luna. Though Celestia figured that out, she already knew me previously, and more importantly, she was Luna's older sister. As such, she knew her better than any pony else at this time, so she gave her the means to figure out that it was Luna that hired me. I had no reason to believe the maid at first about her orders, but that look on her face and the tone of her voice, that told me that at least she thought that her orders were real, so at the very least, I still had to follow her to see who knew my connection to Luna. And if it was actually Luna that ordered her to fetch me. I had to talk to her as to why she needed me to be away from my evidence and my personal library. I am. I apologize for not telling you who I was earlier. I'm not exactly at liberty to talk. She groaned slightly, giving me that
I'm not paid enough to do this crap
expression, the one that encounters so frequently in everyday life. Not that I blame her, having to deal with a smelly crazed stallion. That must have been the last thing she expected to do at around 8:40 a.m. in the morning.
Just follow me and don't wander off.
And so I did. Despite the fact that I was surrounded by beautiful art, exquisite architecture, and the sound of chirping mockingbirds, I was focused on another piece of exquisite architecture. By exquisite architecture, I mean that particular maid's round and well-sculpted ass that was still visible despite the rather conservative and professional maid attire that she was wearing. I will be the first one to admit that me staring was probably due to the fact that I denied myself any tail over the last year and beyond, but it probably also had to deal with a newfound pep in my step that I felt the moment I left the Celestial Archive. I shouldn't have been feeling that well. Fucking Tartarus, I should have died back there, yet I was feeling like I drank a whole mug of coffee, not to mention that I suddenly felt 15 years younger. I wasn't exactly middle-aged, being 35 back then, but the war, the adventures with Bronze Savage, my detective work, and the occult dealings and investigation that had really just taken its mental and physical toll on me, yet at that moment, I felt as fresh as when I first started. Which, instead of being a source of joy, perplexed and worried, when I did make a deal for something like that, and what it was that I agreed in exchange for it, knowing many a demon, fae, and decaying half-dead gods, the price couldn't have been cheap. The price probably hadn't even been paid yet, and there was the possibility that it was something that I never knew that I had in the first place. not to mention the fact that I didn't remember a thing.
You're being pretty quiet back there.
The maid with the seafoam mane and green eyes told me, as she looked back at me with her sandy yellow face. She was giving me that tilted inquisitive look for a second there, as we kept trotting. Sorry, sweetheart, I was lost in thought. Though, I thought you maids preferred to avoid talking with guests, considering how most high-class guests usually look at you as furniture rather than another pony. I'll admit, I was grasping at straws, but let's face it, if anything is universally common around the world, it's the higher-class contempt for the working class. Their pampered, silver spoon-fed lives render them incapable of comprehending what real labor is like. Sure, that's not true everywhere, but in Canterlot, the stereotype applies to such a degree that it can practically be considered parody. And you all were wondering why I would destroy Canterlot if I could get away with it? That's one of the reasons. Honestly, 1 week of planning, bomb making, and me placing a bomb on each of the magical anchors is all I would have had to do to achieve that. But alas, one cannot make the entire city pay for its sins if it's wealthiest. It's not exactly sane. You know, it's funny how Canterlot's unique brand of corruption keeps crime hidden away and ignored so that it can always claim to be the most peaceful city in Equestria, but in reality, it's not that much better off than Manhattan. Of course, that's probably because the common Manhattanite back then was more interested in actually solving a problem rather than keeping their property values up.
You're not exactly giving me the impression of a socialite or a noble, not even a foreign one. Your accent sounds like it's from the Celtic Isles, but some of your vocabulary is undoubtedly equestrian.
She was curious, so I saw no harm in making conversation. And you would be correct, my lass. I'm actually from Manhattan, and you could argue that I'm just a consultant sorcerer, of sorts. I've been on hard times, so I was relieved that the princesses gave me some honest work. Had a bit of an incident last night with some commissioned researching material, so I barely made it out alive. Her Royal Highness just had me join her breakfast to make sure that I can continue working, and as for my accent, that's real, lassie. I'm of Celtic descent. It was barely a half-truth, but it should have been good enough to sate her curiosity.
So, you're just one of the scientists that the princess likes to throw grants to when she catches wind of research that she likes? That does explain the stubble. I might imagine that you barely get to leave the lab for any social outgoing, so you don't bother much with appearances. Doesn't explain the toned muscles, though.
She spoke that last sentence almost as a whimper, but I still heard it. I couldn't help but think mischievously, but then I reminded myself that I was in the middle of a job, and that my last relationship ended with me having to talk to Redheart about ending it, for her own happiness and future. And I went from having a wolfish smirk to a somber scowl in less than a few seconds. She didn't see that as we kept trotting. She was actually paying attention to where she was going.
My name is actually C. Sandstone Cove. Normally we maids don't talk to guests, but the way I see it, us who serve the princesses should stick together. They may pay well and have the best of intentions, but it doesn't mean that they won't work us ragged. Am I right?
Sandstone was pretty playful for a maid. Though she was young, for her looks and attitude, I would say 25 at most. Though she was no child, that was certainly true. How she got one of my duffel bags was a bit of a mystery, but it's possible that whoever brought me to the medical wing in the castle brought them one of my duffel bags with spare clothes and ammo. Well, Miss Cove, I personally couldn't agree more. Though, call me surprised. What is a West Coast pony like you doing in Canterlot? Not that I'm one to talk, considering my own birthplace on the East Coast. But Canterlot is... well, it's the last place that you would expect to see a mare like yourself. Say what you will, but Canterlot's anal retentiveness is something that I could barely stomach. A West Coast mare like her must have found it maddening when she came to the city.
Well, what if I told you that Princess Celestia herself sent me a letter with an airship ticket, and interviewed me herself the moment I got out of an airstrip? So, as it turns out, We met when she went to Los Alicorn to see what a film studio looks like, and I was working as a stage hoof, and we managed to get into a rather riveting conversation on how I needed a higher-paying job, and after she left, I thought that would be the last I would see of our illustrious ruler, until I got the letter.
What did I tell you? Celestia isn't a manipulative tyrant. Take it from some pony that has seen his number of conspiracies. I know a real one when I see it.
Oh, and by the way, we're here.
She said that as she stopped and turned around. I tried my best to fake a smile as a bit of an attempt at being polite. So you think I can see you later, sweetheart? She gave me a genuine smile. Not the kind that would teach you to fake in castle maid training for delegates, nobles, and diplomats, but an actual smile as an actual show of affection.
Sorry, I can't really guarantee that, but I'll do talk to the princesses to see if I have some time off.
She accented that with a wink as she opened the door for me. I trotted through, and then I heard the sound of the doorknobs click behind me. I looked back to notice that the door was closed, and I still had the duffel bag floating beside me. You know, it was a shame that I couldn't gallop away with the lass. My sense of responsibility wouldn't let me.